Vice President Kamala Harris will make history this week as the first U.S. vice president to visit Vietnam. She started her trip to Asia in Singapore, meeting with the country's prime minister earlier today. But while her goal was to highlight how countries are working together, the situation in Afghanistan continued to dominate the conversation. For more on this, I want to bring in CBS News White House reporter Tim Perry. Good morning, Tim. How are you this morning?
Hey, how are you, Christina?
All right, so what came out of Vice President Harris's meeting with the Singaporean prime minister?
Well, I think that the news out of that press conference was the Prime Minister of Singapore announced that the country would offer assistance in some of the airlifts that we've been seeing from Afghanistan. And you know, that just adds on to some of the partnership that we've seen from Singapore as it relates to combating terrorism in Afghanistan for the 20 years that we've been in the country. Additionally, we've seen that there is going to be additional partnerships in addressing climate, an issue that is a top priority for Vice President Harris, and cybersecurity threats. The two announced that the two countries would be participating in information sharing and training. And finally, the Vice President and the Singapore Prime Minister announced that they would begin working together in combating the COVID-19 pandemic, especially as it relates to addressing how to stop any types of variants that come out in the future.
When it comes to Singapore agreeing to help with the evacuation efforts out of Afghanistan, do we know what kind of support they'll be providing? Will they be sending planes in, or are they going to do what we've seen other countries do, where they kind of offer flights, onward flights, right after they get out of Afghanistan? Then, you know, people will help with commercial airlines with other support in those countries kind of around Kabul.
Right. The details have not fully been worked out yet, but from what the Prime Minister said, he would be offering assistance from the Singapore Air Force in getting some of the airlifts going out of Kabul and, you know, helping with that effort.
So Singapore and the U.S. have a pretty good relationship, but Singapore also has strong ties to China. Have we heard anything about how the Chinese government feels about this high-profile visit?
Oh, we absolutely have heard about how the Chinese government feels about this. They've called this a provocation, and they've also said that this is just another example of an outdated Cold War effort by the United States in trying to contain China. And the Singapore government officials as well have said that they will not be a pawn in this growing battle between China and the United States. And for the Americans' part as well, they've said that their goal is not to make Singapore or Vietnam choose sides between the two countries, but find areas where they can work together. But there's no question about it that Harris's trip follows Defense Secretary Austin's trip just about a month ago to that region. And White House officials have told me that navigating the relationship between China and the United States is a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration.
And Tim, Harris was asked repeatedly about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan during today's news conference following her meeting with Singapore's prime minister. Have the events in Afghanistan overshadowed her trip?
I think that overshadow is kind of an understatement at this point. These are kind of the only questions she's been asked during this trip, and she attempted to get ahead of it by addressing the elephant in the room, if you will, before she left D.C. last week. But she was asked several times if the United States has made any mistakes in the evacuation efforts, and every time she kind of dodged the question and instead said that the top priority for America is getting American citizens and Afghan civilians who helped Americans during the 20 years out of the country as soon as possible.
Well, as we mentioned, this next part of the trip will be the first time a U.S. vice president has visited Vietnam. Why is that significant, and what can we expect from the next part of this trip?
Right, it's the first time a sitting vice president has visited the nation, and it's significant because it comes almost 40 years after the United States left Vietnam, and the comparisons, as we've repeated over the last week or so now, between the fall of Kabul and Saigon in 1973 are pretty stark. Though the White House continues to say, these were two completely different nations, two completely different instances. Let's not draw on the historical comparisons too closely, but the symbolism is definitely there, considering the progress that we've seen between the relationship between Vietnam and the U.S. in the some 40 years after the United States left that country. And I'm sure the Vice President will highlight some of that symbolism when she visits the embassy in Hanoi later this week. But we can't underestimate the fact that Vietnam is an authoritarian country, and while Harris is in the country, she does plan on meeting with some representatives of the civil society to address some of the human rights concerns that the United States State Department has raised with the country in the past.
Certainly some historically ironic timing there. Thank you very much, Tim Perry. I know you'll be tracking that for us.